My experience all began before I was born. And no, this isn't a tale of past lives. I wish it was something as reassuring or positive like that. My tale comes in two parts. The first is a story my aunt had told me, an experience I always teased her about and laughed off as nothing more than a fable. I come from the north of England, and we northerners aren't really known for being gullible or superstitious. Nor is there much religion from where I'm from. I'm telling you this so you understand that I was raised as an atheist and was very skeptical, even as a child. Unfortunately for me, events would take place that would leave me questioning my own beliefs and wondering if her stories were all real. It all started when my aunt was around 8 or 9. It was Christmas Day in the early 70s, and she was ripping open her last remaining present. To her surprise and delight, it was a doll, but not just any doll. It was the doll she had seen in town months ago and had begged her grandmother to buy. She had been devastated when my grandmother refused, not realizing my grandmother had actually already purchased one of the dolls and it was secretly stashed away in the loft, ready for Christmas. Now she was staring down into its plastic eyes and blonde hair, the beautiful doll. It was the one thing she had wanted above all else, and as she pulled the doll from its package in the blink of an eye, she hugged it and exclaimed that it was the greatest present she had ever wanted and that they would be best friends forever. She named it Wendy. Being similar in size to my aunt, the doll was the perfect best friend. My aunt would spend hours talking to it, dressing Wendy in clothes my aunt had just grown out of, and scribbling on the doll's face with crayon to imitate makeup. She would host tea parties, and Wendy would be the star attraction. Lynn would spend hours having one-sided conversations with her, as most little girls do with their dolls. Everything seemed completely normal. My grandparents and my dad never once suspected my aunt was in any danger whenever she was in a room alone with Wendy the doll. But they were wrong. One night, my aunt found herself awake when everyone else in the house was asleep. There was nothing special about the night. Nothing in particular had woke her up. She was just simply awake. Climbing from her bed, my aunt, still partially asleep, staggered out of her room and began walking downstairs for a glass of water. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard movement above. Looking up, she saw glances of movement scurrying by the stairs banister. Following the movement with her eyes, her heart almost stopped when she traced the motion to the top of the stairs. Her blood ran cold and she couldn't speak. The sight before her was so confusing and terrifying that it had stolen her ability to form words. Standing there at the top of the stairs was her doll, Wendy, but that couldn't be right. She had left the doll at the bottom of her bed. How could she possibly be standing there at the top of the stairs? Still, it was Wendy. Her Wendy. She wouldn't hurt her, and this was surely every little girl's dream for her doll to come to life. Sadly, that momentary naivete and childlike whimsy disappeared as she stared longer at the doll. Darkness folded around the doll's features, and the top of the stairs grew darker and darker, as if a cloud hung over it. Wendy's crayon-stained face was different. In the shadows, there was a new sinister intent behind Wendy's lifeless plastic eyes, and an insidious look upon her face that filled my aunt with dread. Even as a child, she had enough instinct to back away a bit. She prayed that this was just some awful dream, some awful nightmare, but before she could even attempt to wake herself up, the unthinkable happened. A voice called out from the top of the stairs, the voice of a small girl, or something attempting to mimic a little girl. It was coming from her doll, a doll that had no ability to talk at all. "Come and play, Lynn," the voice called out. My aunt said her whole body began to shake, and she could literally feel herself turning white. She said that she had never felt such a feeling before or since that could compare to that reality-shattering dread. She said it was probably the same kind of feeling a swimmer or surfer has when they are pulled down by a shark. That reminder that this world is not safe or fair, and that any moment destiny could strike you down with a terrible fate. She said she wanted to scream, but that the inconceivable was happening to her, and her sheer shock was too overwhelming. She could do nothing other than stand there shaking. Then the doll called to her once more, even raising one of her arms up slowly, causing her plastic limbs to grind together and let out a spine-chilling creak. My aunt let out a silent scream and collapsed. She recalled feeling like she was fainting, but her eyes were still open as she tumbled to the floor. She said the worst part about that incident was that she lay at the bottom of the step with the darkness encroaching her sight. The final thing she caught a glimpse of was Wendy running back to her room. The following morning, my grandfather found my aunt at the bottom of the steps, cold and terrified. She recounted her tale to my grandparents, but they never believed her. Who would? This was Newcastle in the 70s, an era and place not really known for its spirituality or open-mindedness. And my grandparents were old-fashioned. My gran believed in heaven and hell and nothing else, and my grandfather believed in nothing. There was no way they would accept that a doll had sprung to life. They told her she must have been dreaming, sleepwalking. Regardless, my aunt was so terrified by the event, she forced my grandparents to get rid of Wendy. I know from the outside looking in, it must have seemed odd, because the doll hadn't actually expressed any desire to hurt her or made any attempt to do so. But my aunt swears that something or someone else was there with the doll, speaking through her, and that the look that was on the doll's face was not a friendly or warming one. It was threatening and terrifying. My gran was devastated that my aunt had become so terrified of the doll. After all, it was an expensive gift. But my grandparents decided it would be best to get rid of her, like my aunt wanted. However, instead of just tossing the doll out, they stored her in the loft. This should have been the end of it, but of course it wasn't. For years, my aunt claimed to hear footsteps pacing along the wooden beams in the loft, and even told me she heard voices, nursery rhymes, crying, all coming from the loft. One of the final nights she could recall activity occurring, she was entering her bedroom, and as she did, she passed under the loft hatch, and just before she closed her door behind her, she heard the voice of a small child whisper, "Let me out." The voice called down from the loft. My aunt looked up, and the minute she did, the hatch fell shut, suggesting someone had briefly pulled it open to whisper down to her, a fear made impossible by the fact that the bolts that kept it shut were on the outside. Horrified by the event, my aunt swapped rooms with my dad to be further away from the loft entrance, and it seemed to help. Strangely, the activity just stopped of its own accord, and my aunt grew up, moved out, and chalked the experience up to a night terror and an overactive imagination. However, whenever I would joke about getting the doll down or going to see her, my Aunt Lynn's skepticism would vanish and be replaced by a terrified and worried look. "Don't ever say that. You stay away from that doll," she would always tell me. I just thought she was a little mad. We all have a mad aunt, but any doubts I had were quickly quashed when I had my own encounter with Wendy. This is where I come in. I'm 23 years old. I was raised on a working-class estate in Newcastle. I never really thought much of my aunt's spooky or scary stories. I just always thought she was trying to scare me. But in hindsight, she seemed genuinely shaken when recounting her experiences. I should have listened to her. It might have stopped me from ever going into that loft. Anyway, my experience with my aunt's beloved doll occurred when I was 17. Coming from a working-class area where people are very community-driven and family-oriented, I didn't hesitate when my grandfather asked me to help him put flooring down in his loft. He had lived there for 40 or 50 years and needed some more space to store stuff. The loft itself had a small section that had flooring in it, and it was there that all the unwanted things lived. Empty containers, dusty photo albums, the Christmas tree, all the holiday decorations, and of course the discarded children's toys. But other than that small section of flooring, the majority of the loft was just wooden beams and that awful yellow fiberglass insulation. The air inside was heavy, dusty, and the ceiling, being quite low, made it feel like a rather claustrophobic place to be. The loft entrance itself was just a hatch in the ceiling. This entrance was directly above the door to my aunt's bedroom. As I've already stated, the loft hatch was locked from the outside, and the loft itself had no light, meaning my grandfather had to use a light attached to a cable. He plugged it in the socket in the corridor below and climbed up into the loft. As I entered, I got hit by a wave of anxiety and surprise when I saw the infamous doll that had terrified my aunt. It was positioned atop a box of tinsel and Christmas tree lights. I would be lying if I said those stories didn't come rushing back in that moment, but at the time I was 17 and thought I knew everything. I just pushed all those scary stories to the back of my mind and got stuck into helping put the boards down. Each time I placed the board down, I felt like Wendy's eyes were fixed on me. It felt like her cold, dead gaze never left me the entire time. By the second day, we had pretty much decked the whole loft. I won't lie, I was relieved. I had no desire to spend any more time in a dark, tight space with that doll that had terrorized my aunt as a child. However, luck was not on my side that day. My grandfather asked me to check if the loft would still shut, without the new flooring blocking or hindering it. Unfortunately for me, this meant that the cable light would have to be taken out of the loft and the hatch closed up. My grandfather volunteered me to stay in the loft, just in case something did block the hatch from closing. I was about to ask to swap roles, but I didn't want him thinking of me as a big girl's blouse, a phrase my grandfather would often use to describe me. Foolishly, my pride got the better of me and I agreed to stay in the loft. But as the light faded, I couldn't help but look back at that child-sized doll sitting there atop her throne of dusty boxes and lost things. As the last rays of light slithered across Wendy's rubbery skin and cold eyes, instinct or something within me made me reach for the hammer my grandfather had been using. Then suddenly I could see nothing. The whole loft was swallowed up by darkness and I was blind. I had never felt so vulnerable. But when nothing immediately happened, I began to ridicule myself silently. But then I heard a faint rustle, like something rattling around in a box. My eyes still hadn't adjusted, but I knew where the sound was coming from. My heart already started to pound and I held my breath for a moment, hoping to hear nothing. But in the silence, I heard one single tap. Then another. And another. And I realized it was footsteps. Small footsteps. Suddenly, the pitter-patter of small feet scrambled along the boards ahead of me, and I would love to say I wasn't frightened. I was terrified. All those stories my aunt had told me, they raced through my mind as the footsteps speeded towards me. I was so scared. I shut my eyes and awaited my fate. I'm not ashamed to admit I was so frightened I couldn't even swing the hammer I was clutching. I just let out a scream. I was sure I would be dead or never seen again. But nothing happened. I opened my eyes and found the whole loft was lit up again, and my granddad was just laughing and shaking his head. He called me a woman and laughed it off. I tried to laugh it off as well, but I was still full of fear. Maybe my grandfather was right. Maybe it was just the dark and my overactive imagination. But all those explanations left my mind when I looked over at the boxes. I went dead silent. My whole body started trembling. My grandfather looked at me and kept asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't summon the words to explain. That's how afraid I was. I knew then that for the moment I truly understood the feeling my aunt had, that dark night when her doll came to life. For you see, Wendy was no longer at the top of the boxes and Christmas decorations that she had been when I first entered. Now she was there resting upon a beam in the far corner, like a child pretending to be asleep or playing dead. Upon her face was a frozen smile, a smile that I felt was aimed at me, a smile that said, all those stories were true. I know you know, and no one else will ever believe you. After that, I didn't stick around. I made a swift exit from the loft, telling my granddad that I had just scared myself. In truth, I couldn't actually believe what had happened. I didn't want to believe it. Needless to say, I never wanted to be around that doll, and so I never went back up into that loft, and my visits to my granddad's house became less frequent. I've since moved down south and have pushed my experience to the back of my mind, and for 6 years of my life I was free of Wendy, until she decided to pay me one last visit. One night I was locked in this awful nightmare. I was lying in bed, and I could hear giggling and could feel something crawling up over my quilt. When I looked down, I saw Wendy crawling up towards my head, and before I could let out a scream, she pulled the covers over my head as if to suffocate me. I thrashed about so wildly I actually woke up my boyfriend beside me. Thankfully, it was just a dream. A terrible nightmare. Even though the nightmare was over, I was so frightened by my experience, I phoned up my auntie the next day and told her all about it. I even confessed to having had my own experience with the doll 6 years ago. She didn't seem surprised, and seemed shocked that I had dreamt about the doll 6 years later. She reassured me, though, that the doll was gone, and she managed to convince my grandfather, who is a bit of a hoarder, to clear out his loft, yet put most of his stuff in a skip. I don't know if it was a coincidence, but my blood ran cold the moment she told me that Wendy had been chucked in that skip too. Strangely, my nightmare happened the night Wendy had been hurled into the skip, and it may seem totally silly, but I just can't help feeling that this was Wendy's last good scare. I rarely get to visit my grandfather now, due to me living so far away, but anytime I do, I get this little shiver down my spine as if Wendy, or the presence behind the doll, is letting me know she isn't completely gone. I keep thinking to myself, what if she climbed out of the skip before she was taken away and climbed back into that loft? I can't shake this feeling that she is still up there, in the darkness and dust, still waiting for someone to play with her.
I've only told this to a handful of people. I know it sounds crazy, and the only other person who can confirm any of this is my little brother, who has since passed away. When I was very young, I rented my first house, a 3-bedroom, 1-bath ranch-style house with a full basement. I rented it from my aunt, who recently married into the family. She had recently inherited the house from her grandfather. The house had been in their family since its original construction when it was a one-room, no plumbing or electricity house. As time went on, the house was expanded and updated. Her grandfather and his dad actually ran the original electricity in the house. My uncle and aunt bought a new house and were starting a family, but they wanted to keep the ranch house, so this was a perfect arrangement. I moved into the house on my own. However, a few other people had a key to get in. My brother, a friend, and an aunt and uncle had a key. The only time I locked the doors when I left or was sleeping. My friend's family just walked in when I was home. My brother would sleep over a few nights a week, and he would spend time in my home even if I wasn't there. Shortly after moving in, weird stuff started happening. Things would go missing or be found where they have no right or reason to be. I'd hear steps in the hallway, then a bedroom door slam close. When I would investigate, no one would be there, and no one else would even be in the house. This would happen a few times a week. Sometimes if I ignored it, the door would open and slam shut 3 times in a row. This would happen with no windows open and no AC or heat current, but still, I convinced myself it was bad hinges, settling, or my imagination. Shortly after that, I started hearing voices, loud enough to hear but too hushed to make out what was being said. So I turned on the TV or play music over it. I almost always had music on anyways. I would tell myself I was being paranoid. Next came lights flashing on and off. This was always coming from another room. I'd see it happening in the kitchen if I was in the living room, or I'd see it down the hall coming from the restroom if I was at the kitchen counter cooking. I would tell myself it was due to the old DIY wiring being flaky. It would happen quick and fast. The light would go on, off, just enough to really get my attention to them. It wasn't long after that I would see things fly by my peripheral vision. This was random and quite scary. Up to now, these things only happened when I was home alone, but this happened a few times when people were over visiting. However, no one else really noticed but me. People would see me react, but that was all. Awkward. About this time, the light on-off game would end with the light being on. I would have to manually flip the switch off, and this really freaked me out as I could no longer blame it on bad wiring, as bad wiring wouldn't flip the switch up and down. I came full circle and just stopped explaining it all away and accepted that my house was haunted. When I told people I had ghosts, they would laugh and then nothing would happen while they were over. So I guess I get why I looked crazy. When I would investigate the doors or turn a light off after the light game, things would calm down. But after some time, I stopped investigating. Why bother? This would cause things to get worse. Then, many lights would go on and off, many doors would slam. Keys I just put down in their spot would disappear. I would literally freak out and have to block doors open with chairs. I would yell things like, "Okay, I get it, you're pissed. You have my full attention now." With sad things would calm. From here on out, little things didn't happen in little spurts. When things happened, it was 2 or 3 things at once, and things would accelerate quickly. So I would yell something like, "I know you're here, knock it off." Just as I'd yell, someone would walk through the door, and I would look crazy. My family started taking it personally. I'm sure I looked crazy, lots of me looking crazy. This happened enough times that when multiple things would happen, I'd say something smart like, "Thanks for the heads up. I wonder who's coming over." Or I'd yell, "Come on in, I'm in the kitchen." Next, this only happened a few times as I moved sooner. After, I'll tell you the first time something happened with my brother present. I had been out pretty much late in the night. I came home and shortly after my brother came over, after he got off work. He was on second shift. We were in my kitchen, music on, eating and talking. Out of nowhere, something flew across the kitchen. We both reacted. Then it flew back, nearly giving us whiplash. We looked at each other like, what the hell? We went to the far corner of the long kitchen, where we thought whatever it was going to be there. But there was nothing there. It flew by again, one last time. Over the shoulder, close enough to feel a breeze. I was actually happy someone else saw what I had been seeing. We were both freaked out. To this day, I think things happened to him when he was in the house alone. I think he wrote it off and explained it away. He was in the house far less than me though. But, really, he was the only person who spent hours and days in the house. Some other things that happened. Every time it rained, hundreds of little frogs would fill the basement. I don't know where they went or where they even came from. Once a huge black snake was in my bed. It crawled up between my legs within a few minutes of me being in bed. I screamed and jumped out of bed. My brother ran in, turned on the light, and pulled the blanket, and we saw this huge black snake. He threw it out of the house. I often felt like I was being watched or lightly touched on the shoulder or neck from behind. I only lived in that house for a little under 6 months. My uncle swore me to secrecy. He was afraid of what my aunt would say if I told her about it, that it would upset her or something. She loved the house. Her grandparents raised her, and she had actually grown up in the house. She had never had any bad experiences in the house. Any thoughts or ideas on what could have been in this house? Any ideas to why it seemed to want me to be scared and to look crazy?
When my husband and I first married, we lived towns apart due to work. We also had a toddler. We decided to move in together as quickly as possible and went house hunting. I have always enjoyed stories of supernatural and paranormal occurrences and joked about how much I would love a haunted house. I was later told by a clairvoyant that the universe delivers. We finally settled on a house that was in our price range. It was built in the 80s, so no concern of lead paint nor historic value. Everything went smoothly for the most part. Our toddler would awaken in the middle of the night and explain that her stuffed animals would move or fly. We figured she just wanted to sleep with us. Moving was a big transition for such a youngster. We got pregnant with another kiddo quickly, and he went out of country for about a year for work. Things were normal for the most part. The baby, 6 to 12-month age range, would sometimes stare at the front door and cry or point behind me when I was doing dishes. Nothing too weird. My husband returned and I eventually decided to remodel the house. It had not been updated since being built. It was a major undertaking. My youngest was probably 2 years old at this point, and the oldest was 6. I became convinced that our house was haunted at this point, and continued to be convinced for about 2 years. It is hard to remember the time frames for everything, but I will describe the activities that occurred during this 2 to 3 year period as best as I can for you. I had a dog who required medication twice daily. It would frequently go missing. I would find it later in the same spot I always kept it. One of my daughters would talk about the little boy that lived in the closet, and that she was afraid of him. So we moved the 2 girls into the same room because they felt a lot better, and maybe they were just lonely or something was my thought. This gave my husband a room to dedicate to his man cave and online PC gaming. My husband would talk about seeing a shadow dart back and forth in the hallway. I had a dream that when we took down the sheetrock, we found a secret room with dead twins who warned us to get out. All of the stuff seemed like normal occurrences that happen in life. But then, I finally became convinced that the house was haunted. My children and husband were all in bed. I had clean laundry waiting to be folded on the chase, but decided to sprawl out on the couch and watch The Breakfast Club instead. Alone time was rare. All of a sudden, a shirt flew from the chase and hit me in the face. I ran to the bedroom and my husband was asleep. I woke him up and he voiced that he didn't believe me, but I knew better because he got anxious and couldn't sleep. The next big event occurred when my youngest told me there was a man in her bedroom. We had a security alarm, so I know this just couldn't be true. I had her take me to the bedroom and show me. She described him as black and pointed, then stated, "He's right there, he's behind you." I told her we would just leave him alone and go about our day. We had other things happen that we just explained away. I woke up to a shadowy figure hovering above my husband. My dogs would wake up in the middle of the night and bark at the foot of the bed. I would hear noises coming from the kids' room and get a terrible feeling when I would check on them. I sometimes had to walk through a cold mist to get into their bedroom. My dogs also would sometimes bark in the hallway. I finally called someone to intervene when my husband met me at my door, freaking out. I worked weekends and would sometimes come home and tell him about my day while he played on his computer. The kids would be in bed by this time. I would then go shower and go to sleep. This night, my husband said I'd already been home and talked to him about my day. I then said I was going to shower, so when he heard the garage door open and the car pull in, he immediately panicked. I was frightened to hear this as well. An entity taking my identity made me feel helpless. A co-worker got me in contact with their friend with special abilities. Her friend came over with another medium. They smudged our home and put quartz crystals in the corner. It was all free. They told me that the limestone behind us had energy in it which attracts transient spirits and entities. Some are good and some are not. The Shadow Man stayed because of my husband's PTSD and was attracted to the negativity. They also said domestic abuse had previously occurred in the man cave at some point, and that was a big focus of negative energy. They taught me to smudge and told me I have ancestors by my side keeping me safe. Things would still happen on occasion after this. We spoke to our Muslim friends about it and they thought it sounded like a jinn. These creatures are mischievous and can be good or bad. They gave us a religious artifact from their hometown that had a prayer in Arabic carved into it. We kept it on our mantle and never had trouble after that. They would always laugh at Christmas time when we had our Christmas mantle decorations in our Muslim artifact. We have since moved, but did spend a decade in that home.
Hello, my name is Julius, and I'm 14 years old. I'm freaking out since this just happened, and I'm alone in my house right now, and I've never really felt right in this house. I mean, there are 2 dogs, but I still just don't feel safe. It was around 11:15 at night, and my dad and I had just gotten back from watching that new movie Sully. We live in a fairly large house, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. This will be important later in the story. Anyway, I'm sitting in a chair in the dining room next to the kitchen. My dad gives a yell to me to brush my teeth. I had headphones on, so it took me a few times to understand what he was saying. I started walking toward the bathroom. I still had my headphones in, but I heard a sound that was outside of my headphones. It was coming from my little brother's room. He's only 2 years old, and I also have a 4-year-old sister. I thought he was still awake, since there was giggling coming from his room. I was told to put him to bed, so I went in. He was asleep. Sound asleep. I couldn't explain what was happening, so I just closed the door. I went to the bathroom when it started again. I knew something was wrong, so I opened the door. This time, his cross on his dresser was bent. It had never been like that before, and I don't know how it got that way. I choked down a gasp, and it was just silent. I heard the giggling coming from my little sister's room, and I could feel goosebumps form on my skin. I slowly turned around and closed my little brother's door. Meanwhile, my dad was watching TV. I slowly opened my little sister's bedroom door, and what I saw will haunt me forever, or at the very least, give me nightmares for years. I honestly don't know how I slept last night. She has a lot of dolls. They are usually on her bed sleeping with her. Like my little brother, she was out like a log, but all of her freaking dolls were scattered across the floor, all looking up at me. Then, when I think things couldn't get any worse, one of the dolls that was from my stepmom's mom was on her dresser, and it just fell off and hit my foot. It rolled off of me, and ended up in a weird position where it was facing up and facing towards me with its head. At this point I had enough and was scared beyond belief. I calmly walked out into the living room and back to my computer at the kitchen table. We went to bed and nothing else happened that night, but when my dad woke up he asked me, "Did you hear the kids laughing last night?"
Hello, my name is Clay. I am a 41-year-old truck driver and married with 3 stepchildren. All my life, even from infancy, I've had experiences with the spirits, ghosts, and demons. I'll start with what happened from before I was born and still in my mother's belly. This is what she experienced while pregnant with me. She lived in a single wide trailer in eastern Kentucky, and the trailer was very haunted. One night, she was in front of a mirror in her bedroom, getting ready for work, and a black shadowy hand came over her head and touched her belly. Keep in mind, she was pregnant with me at this time. While that happened, she got a strong thought in her head that said the boys marked. After I was born, I was a very sensitive child to paranormal. I would see and hear unexplained things. When I was 5, my aunt and immediate family all moved into a new house my grandmother built for us. It was a small 3-bedroom brick home, ranch style, but nothing fancy. We lived there for 15 years. It was the house I grew up in, but the first 8 years were a nightmarish hell. It was all wool peddling walls, and in the walls of the paneling, you could see distorted faces just looking at you. My sister and I would play and run up and down the hallways of the house. While doing so, we would see heads peeking around the corners of the doorways of the bedrooms. There were times the air would be so heavy, you cannot stay in the house. It was a heavy feeling of being watched and unwanted. Stuffed toys would be moved about like they were alive. I actually had a stuffed dog that one night his eyes started blinking at me. If you put any stuffed toy in a room with you, eventually it'll be staring at you. One time my sister left her bedroom and went to get something out of the refrigerator, and when she returned to her room it was trashed. Even the mattress of her bed was on the floor. I got to blame even though everyone knew it couldn't have been me because I was in the kitchen with her at the time. Another time, we all woke up to what sounded like running on the ceiling of my house. My dad and I followed it from one end to the other of the house. Finally, my grandma comes to visit, and my mother is telling her about all the things that are going on. My grandma said we needed to burn everything. Furniture, toys, everything the spirit could attach itself to. So we did. That seemed to take care of the problem for the most part. We still had minor things happen once in a while, but very far and few between. The face peeking around the doors was gone. The distorted faces in the paneling disappeared. No more noises or ominous feelings. The very last thing that happened to me in that house was a few years later, and it was minor. I got up. It was getting ready to leave for school. I turned all the lights out, and before I walked out the door, the living room light came back on. But it never happened again after that. I have other stories and experiences. Perhaps I will share them someday.
This story has about 3 parts, and they all related to each other over time that leads me to think that my house is haunted. So for a backstory, I live on the coast in the middle of about 13 acres of woods we own, and about 27 more acres surround us all around our property, as well with a few people who live close by. Ever since I was a kid, I liked spells and magic, so I would play with that type of thing. Nothing happened, I think, but these stories make me question that. So this first part is from when I was about 5 or so, and I still remember it so well that it scares me. One night, I had gotten in trouble with my parents for sassing off to them, and they sent me to my room. It was dark out when I was tossing a clear, sparkly plastic Cinderella shoe around the room. I accidentally tossed it into the floor, and it toppled to the floor of my closet. I got out of my bed and picked up the shoe, but when I stood back up, my eyes locked with a young woman with shoulder-length fawn-colored hair and green eyes. As for what she wore, I forgot, but I do know it was shorts and a top with a jacket tossed carelessly across her shoulders, and she was pale, as well as had burn marks on her left arm and right leg. She looked at me and I looked at her. Then, she walked into one wall toward the hallway and turned back around and walked back into my closet. Soon after, walking back through the other side of the wall. After that, I saw her every night for many weeks, and I called her my ghost friend or Meg as I got older. After about 2 years of telling people about her, no one would listen, and people began telling me I was insane, so I stopped talking about it, and kind of forgot about her and my stories. Well, I guess I didn't forget exactly, I just stopped thinking about it. For the second part was from about a year ago. One night, our neighbors, the closest people to us about 1/4 mile away, were having a big party that night, and the noise was so loud that even from as far apart as we were, we could still hear them. I am a heavy sleeper, but it was just loud enough to keep me from sleeping. So instead of sleeping, I laid down for about an hour, staring holes from concentration into my ceiling above me. Then at about 11 p.m. they had shut off the music, playing something other than loud rap music, and played something a little softer, and I ended up falling asleep at some point. At about 2 a.m., the music once again got loud as it played one last song that sounded like thunder right over us, as it was so loud. So it once again got silent, but I laid there for what felt like hours trying to sleep, but I could not fall asleep. I wondered if maybe I had to pee, which is why, usually I can't sleep sometimes. I pushed my pelvis with my finger to try and see if I needed to pee, and found I did. So I got up, climbed down from my bunk bed, and walked to the living room. I went to the bathroom in the dark since I knew my house from living in it for 5 years non-stop, since our family liked to move around from house to house, but always had this one to go as well. I was leaving the bathroom when I heard a low, inhuman growl that was almost like it was wiped away in the wind, even though it was indoors. I froze in fear and looked around the living room before me. My eyes then landed on a black aura in the far corner, where a feeling of hate and anger filled my head. I could feel auras and spirits, so I was usually used to this, but when the thing's hate filled the room, I got a little scared. The atmosphere thickened like glue and the weight pushed down every inch of my soul and being. It got closer as the black aura grew, and then the sound of growling and shaggy breathing made me run into my room as fast as I could, even though it was only like 2 or 3 meters away from me. I slammed my wooden bedroom door, jumped into bed, and did my best to create positive energy to keep it out. The third part was just about 4 days ago. I shower usually every other day, and so one night my shower time came, so I brought my Echo into my bathroom and put on my Pandora station and sung the songs while I was in the shower. I had just put the shampoo into my hair when the song was transferring to the next song and I hear a whistle. It was foggy but very clear. I stopped and peeled back the curtains and yelled to my mom, asking her if she was trying to prank me. No answer. I asked my brother the same thing. No answer. I asked if anyone was there. Still no answer. So I go back into the water and finish my shower quickly. I grabbed my Echo and ran out into my living room and into the kitchen with a reddish towel tied around my chest, which went down to my upper thighs. I asked my mother about it, and she said she did not even go up there because she was making some banana bread for us all to eat, and my brother was asleep upstairs. Then I sat down in the corner of the counter and told my mom all about it. My mom found it odd that my usually 30-minute showers were cut down to less than 7 minutes. Then my dad, who was traveling for work purposes up near New York, called up and was telling us his brother, who was with him, was just telling him about his experience with the ghosts in our house a few years ago. Basically, my Uncle Mike had gone to our house while we were in New Orleans and took his friend with him as they were coming down to see my grandmother and Uncle Mike's mother. It was late that night, and Mike's friend had gone up to the restroom. Then, as he was entering the back room, he heard a woman's voice behind him that said, "When are you going to leave?" He froze, turned around and woke Mike, and told him he could not stay, and left my house and will not come back inside till this very day.
This all happened a few years ago in a little hick town. My friends and I were bored as hell, so we decided to find some trouble to get into. My friend mentioned a super creepy house in the middle of nowhere that had been sitting empty for a little over a year. We decided since we didn't have anything better to do, we should go check it out. So, the 6 of us crammed into a car and headed over there. It was around 3 a.m., middle of summer. The moon was full and it lit up everything around us. We parked a little way up the road and walked up to the house. It was definitely spooky in the moonlight. It kind of looked like the creepy house from the Blair Witch Project. We were originally just going to walk around the property, but my boyfriend at the time decided to kick the door open and explore inside as well. 3 of my friends stayed outside to watch for cops. The cops didn't normally patrol the area, but we wanted to be extra safe. The other 2 and I went inside. I made it 6 feet into the house probably before I got hit with a really weird, heavy feeling. It felt like I was being wrapped in a thick blanket, but instead of being warm and cozy, it was oddly cold. I noped the F out of there as fast as I could. My boyfriend and our friend, let's call him Tim, teased me, saying that I was just being a pussy. I knew something was weird in that house and I just refused to go back in. Tim decided to record their walk through the house. After walking through the house, Tim picked something up, threw it at my boyfriend, and started screaming to spook him. Well, it worked and they ran out. The three of us then started looking through a shed in the back. We found various hunting traps. It looked pretty old and rusted, so I assumed they were just hung up for decoration. My boyfriend decided to take one to remember that night. I'm pretty sure the trap that he stole that night might have had something attached to it. A lot of weird stuff started happening on our place after that, but those are stories for another time. We left shortly after. When we got back home, we watched the video took and tied the house. After we laughed at my boyfriend's screams, Tim said he thought he heard something weird in the video. So we played it back, and sure enough, while they're running out of the house, there's a voice in the video. It was a woman's voice clearly saying, "She died here." We collectively lost our crap. I was the only girl there that night, and the sound of them screaming and running would have drowned out my talking. I wish I still had the video for proof, but I had a falling out with Tim and deleted our messages, so I don't have the video anymore, unfortunately. I still beat myself up over for not saving it. I used to be terrified of the paranormal, so I didn't save it when I first got it. I've come to accept that I'll always have some weird paranormal experiences, and it'll always be part of my life. That video was the first paranormal experience I've had solid evidence of.
About 10 years ago, I lived in a pretty active house for 3 years. I was 17 to 19 at the time. It started small but escalated slowly. On the day we moved in, my mom, sister, and I, the neighbors greeted us, a nice older couple. In conversation, they mentioned that the past 3 families have moved out after a year, but I didn't think much of it. As we unpacked, I went into the attic to put away storage boxes and found that the attic was already full of boxes. Full of random things, clothes, toys, and old Atari systems and all kinds of stuff. We thought it was weird but made room for our things and left it all there. The house had a creepy feeling from the start. The being watched feelings and sometimes the feeling that you were somewhere you shouldn't be, especially in the hallway. We had 2 cats and they would be laying down and then look up and seem to watch something cross the room. Sometimes they follow it to the next room. Nothing there. No bugs, nothing. Fast forward 6 months and we started hearing footsteps in the attic, heavy boot-sounding steps from one end of the house to the other. Then, we would hear boxes sliding across the plywood attic floor as well. This got to be an almost daily occurrence. We knew it wasn't squirrels making the sounds. A while later, my girlfriend at the time had moved in with us, and she had witnessed what we had and more, and it was bad. It started escalating a lot. We would stay up late watching TV. Not every night, but some nights, the TV would turn to Channel 5 on its own, always between 3 and 3:05 a.m. The cable box would still display whatever channel I was watching, and the remote would stop working. I would have to unplug the cable box and get it to reset. On the back door were long blinds that would clack against the door with the slightest movement. On 2 occasions, my girlfriend and I were watching the bottom corner of the blinds silently be pulled away from the door, about a foot, and slowly back down. One day, I was going into the garage. I opened the door from the kitchen, and the big trash can we kept just to the left of the door immediately slid about 2 feet to block my way into the garage. That was the first time I had genuinely felt scared of what or who was there. A while after that, it got intense for me specifically. On 8 occasions, I was slapped in the face moments after I laid down in bed. It wasn't the falling feeling you get when you fall asleep. It was complete awake and aware. There was an audible smack, and my head was forced into the pillow. My face would be cold and all pins and needles and every hair in my body stood up. Every time. Most times I would sense of a dense black figure in the bedroom doorway afterwards, and those were the only times I saw apparitions in the house. A little while after the slapping started, my grandparents came to visit. My grandpa is very sensitive to spirits, so I was interested to see what he felt. Within minutes of coming into the house, my grandfather looked to the left, shook off a chill and said, "Well, you gotta live in this joint?" So that pretty much confirmed it for us, that we weren't crazy. We told him about a little bit of the activity, but not everything, because it would have turned into a week-long rant from my grandfather. Anyway, the next day, I woke up and he was already awake. He immediately led me to the hall closet, where we have always had that feeling that we were somewhere we shouldn't be. He said he got up last night to use the bathroom, and when he had passed the closet, he was stopped and felt he needed to open it. He said he saw a small dark wooden door with a silver metallic handle. As soon as he reached for the door handle, it disappeared and all he saw was drywall. He then opened the closet door and pointed out to me that there was about a 5 by 5 foot completely walled out space behind the closet, and the faint outline of a small door had been drywalled shut. Basically, a small, inaccessible room. We tried to look up the history of the house but couldn't find anything. Shortly after I ended up moving out though. I've had a few other experiences since, but nothing like that house. That house was proof beyond anything that the paranormal exists to me. It got unnerving towards the end, but it hooked me into the paranormal.